"Get out, you are nothing but a disappointment." My father's words echoed through our family's luxurious living room, his face red with rage. I stood there, my hands steady despite the storm raging inside me. Behind him, my mother sat perched on our imported Italian sofa, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. It was the same expression she had worn throughout my childhood. "I built this company from nothing," he continued, gesturing to the various awards and recognition plaques that lined our walls. "And you refuse to follow the path I set for you. Instead, you waste time with your innovative ideas and sustainable business models." The way he spat those words made them sound like insults. To him, they were. "Dad, if you would just look at my proposal," I started. But he cut me off with a dismissive wave. "Enough, Olivia. Your brother managed to secure 3 major contracts this month alone. Meanwhile, you are still talking about long-term sustainability and ethical business practices. This is not some university classroom." My brother Marcus was, of course, the golden child who followed our father's every command. He never questioned the old ways of doing business, and did not care if their practices were destroying the environment or exploiting workers, as long as the profit margins kept growing. "The industry is changing," I said firmly, refusing to back down. "If Harrison Industries does not adapt, it will fail." "Out," he roared, making my mother flinch. "Pack your things and get out of my house. Since you think you know better than 30 years of business experience, go prove it. But do not come crawling back when you fail." I did not cry, and I did not beg. Instead, I walked to my room with my head held high, packed my essentials, and walked out of the mansion I had called home for 28 years. My mother did not even get up to say goodbye. That was 3 years ago. I would love to say I immediately became successful or that I proved them wrong overnight. But real life is not that simple. The first 6 months were brutal. I moved into a tiny studio apartment, survived on instant noodles, and worked 18-hour days building my company from scratch. Sterling Industries started small, just me, my laptop, and an unwavering belief that business could be both profitable and ethical. I used my savings to hire 2 brilliant engineers who had been overlooked by the major corporations because they did not fit the traditional mold. Together, we developed revolutionary green technology that could cut industrial energy consumption by 60%. The breakthrough came when a mid-sized manufacturing company took a chance on us. Our system saved them millions in energy costs, while significantly reducing their carbon footprint. Word spread quickly in the industry. By the end of our first year, Sterling Industries had grown from 3 people in a cramped office to 30 employees occupying half a floor in a downtown building. I made sure to keep my name out of the press. Sterling Industries was known for its innovative CEO, Ms. Evans, but few people knew that Olivia Evans was actually Olivia Harrison, the daughter my parents had thrown away. By our second year, Sterling Industries had offices in 3 major cities and a client list that included some of the biggest names in manufacturing. I had deliberately built a wall between my professional identity and my past. To the world, I was Olivia Evans, a ruthless and visionary leader who was transforming the industrial sector. To my parents, I was likely still the failure they imagined was struggling to pay rent in some rundown apartment. I followed the news of Harrison Industries from a distance, and the data told a story of a dying empire. They were bleeding talent, their stock price was staggering, and my father's refusal to modernize was finally catching up with him. He was desperate, and a desperate man is prone to making fatal mistakes in judgment. The turning point came with the announcement of the Maxwell contract. Maxwell Corp was the undisputed titan of sustainable technology manufacturing. Landing a partnership with them was the ultimate seal of approval. It was the kind of deal that could save a failing company or turn a successful one into a global powerhouse. I knew that my father and Marcus were putting every remaining resource they had into securing this deal. It was their Hail Mary, their last chance to prove they were still relevant. What they didn't realize was that I had spent the last 6 months playing a much larger game. Through a complex series of shell companies and strategic investments, Sterling Industries had quietly acquired a controlling interest in Maxwell Corp. I wasn't just competing for the contract. I had become the one who decided who won it. I sat in my high-rise office, looking at the contract proposal from Harrison Industries that my assistant had just placed on my desk. I couldn't help but smile at the sheer arrogance of it. The document was filled with the same empty buzzwords and hollow promises my father had used for decades. They were trying to fake their way into a green energy partnership without actually changing their toxic core. They were promising sustainability on paper while planning to use the same old exploitative labor and environmental shortcuts behind the scenes. They thought they could buy their way back to the top with a polished presentation and a few handshakes. They had no idea that the person reviewing their fate was the very daughter they had cast out for being useless. I picked up my signature stamp, the one that had approved deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. For a moment, I thought about my father's face that night in the living room, the way he had roared at me to get out. I thought about my mother's silence as she watched me leave with a single suitcase. I had the power to end Harrison Industries with one press of my hand, but I wasn't ready to finish it just yet. I wanted them to feel the hope of the deal before I pulled the rug out from under them. In bright red ink, I marked the proposal as rejected. But this wasn't just about revenge. It was about the next phase of my plan. I instructed my assistant to set up a meeting with the board of Harrison Industries for the following morning. I told her to inform them that the CEO of Sterling Industries would be attending in person to discuss a potential acquisition. It was time for Olivia Harrison to go home. The Harrison Industries lobby had not changed in 3 years, and walking through those revolving doors felt like stepping back into a museum of my own past. It was still filled with the same pretentious marble floors, the same overly dramatic artwork, and the same receptionists who wore plastic smiles like a required uniform. But this time, as I walked across the polished stone in my tailored designer suit, I wasn't the disappointing daughter seeking a moment of her father's time. I was Olivia Evans, the CEO of Sterling Industries, the woman whose company was currently the talk of the entire industrial world. I informed the receptionist that I had a 9 a.m. meeting with the board, and I watched with a cold satisfaction as she straightened her posture and treated me with a level of deference I had never received when my last name was Harrison. The elevator ride to the top floor brought back a flood of memories that I had tried to bury. I remembered how many times I had stood in this exact same elevator, clutching folders full of research and proposals that my father would never even bother to read. I remembered the feeling of my heart racing as I tried to prepare myself for another round of dismissal or mockery. My assistant, Sarah, stood beside me with a tablet in hand, leaning in to whisper that their latest quarterly reports had arrived that morning. She told me they were in even worse shape than our initial projections had suggested. The rejection from Maxwell Corp had hit their stock price like a sledgehammer, and the board was likely in a state of total panic. I nodded slowly, knowing that the timing was perfect. When the boardroom doors opened, I walked into a room filled with faces that had haunted my career. My father sat at the head of the long mahogany table, looking significantly older than I remembered. The constant stress of watching his empire crumble had carved deep lines into his face and turned his hair into a duller shade of gray. My brother Marcus sat to his right, attempting to project his usual air of unearned confidence, but he couldn't hide the twitch in his hand or the way his eyes darted toward the door. My father stood up and extended his hand, thanking me for coming on such short notice. It was almost comical to realize that he didn't recognize me. 3 years of a different name, a different style, and the unmistakable aura of success had changed me more than I had realized. I shook his hand firmly, feeling the slight tremor in his grip, and took my seat at the opposite end of the table. I decided to skip the pleasantries and get straight to the point. I told the board that we all knew why I was there. I laid out the brutal facts. Harrison Industries was failing. Their profits had dropped by 60%, and their major clients were jumping ship to companies that actually cared about modern standards. I watched Marcus lean forward to interrupt, but I cut him off before he could speak. I told them that for 3 years they had refused to adapt, and now the market was finally forcing them to pay the price. The silence in the room was absolute as I opened my folder and prepared to deliver the offer that would either save them or finalize their destruction. I scanned the faces of the board members, seeing a mixture of terror and barely concealed hope in their eyes. My father remained motionless, his face pale and his gaze fixed on the folder I had placed directly in front of him. I began my presentation, my voice sounding cold and professional, exactly as a corporate leader should. I stated that Sterling Industries was prepared to make an official offer for the acquisition of Harrison Industries. We were ready to modernize their outdated factories, retain the majority of their workforce, and implement the very sustainable technologies that I had tried to propose to them 3 years ago. I emphasized that this was not just a deal, but their only chance to avoid a total bankruptcy that would arrive within 6 months, according to my projections. Marcus, whose arrogance had always outweighed his intelligence, jumped up from his seat. He began shouting that this was a hostile takeover and that they would never sell the family business to some newcomer. He waved his arms and demanded that I leave the building immediately. I simply smiled and looked at him with the pity one usually feels for an unreasonable child. I calmly replied that without this deal, they would have nothing left, not even their family name on the front of this building. The board members began to whisper among themselves, exchanging panicked glances. They understood that the numbers in my documents did not lie. Unlike my father and brother, they were more interested in their own shares and pensions than in ghostly family pride. My father finally spoke, and his voice was raspy. He asked why a successful company like Sterling Industries was suddenly interested in their sinking ship. He narrowed his eyes, trying to see something familiar in my features, as if old instincts were starting to trigger deep in his mind. I slowly stood up and walked to the window, which offered a view of the city I had once left with a single suitcase. I told him that in business there is no room for sentiment, but there is room for the restoration of justice. I reminded him of the Sustainable Technology Development Plan that was presented in this very room 3 years ago, which he had called naive and useless. The room fell into a deathly silence. I slowly turned back to him and looked him directly in the eyes. I saw recognition flash in his pupils, followed by shock, and then a deep, crushing realization. "Olivia," he whispered, and his voice broke. Marcus froze in place, his mouth hanging open in silent amazement. "Yes, Dad," I replied, maintaining absolute calm. "It is the same disappointing daughter you threw out onto the street. Now I am here not to ask for your approval. I am here to take what you could not protect and turn it into something worthy of the future. The offer is valid for 24 hours and not a second longer." The 24-hour deadline I had imposed hung over the room like a sharpened blade, and the silence that followed my revelation was heavy with the scent of old regrets and new fears. My father looked as if he had aged another 10 years in a matter of seconds, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched the edge of the mahogany table that had once been his throne. Marcus tried to regain his composure, his face twisting into a mask of indignant fury. But the rest of the board members were no longer looking at him for leadership. They were looking at me, and then they were looking at the exit. They were calculating the value of their own survival against the crumbling pride of a man who had led them into a dead end. I walked back to my seat and sat down, crossing my legs with a deliberate slowness that signaled I was in no hurry to leave while they processed the shock. My father finally found his voice, though it was nothing more than a hollow rasp. He asked me how I had done it, how I had built something so massive and so secret right under his nose. I told him that while he was busy mocking my ideas in country clubs, I was working in a studio apartment with people who actually believed in the future. I explained that Sterling Industries succeeded because it filled the void that Harrison Industries had created through its own arrogance. I told him that I didn't need his name or his money because I had something far more valuable, which was a vision that actually worked. Marcus finally exploded, slamming his fist onto the table and shouting that they should call security to have me removed for corporate espionage or some other imagined crime. He turned to the board members, pleading with them to see me as a traitor who was trying to destroy the family legacy. But the lead board member, a man named Mr. Henderson, who had known my father for decades, held up a hand to quiet him. "Mr." Henderson looked at me with a mixture of professional respect and personal curiosity. He noted that the terms I had offered were more than fair, and in fact, they were generous considering the current state of their balance sheets. He looked at my father and told him plainly that they didn't have a choice. If they didn't sign the acquisition papers by the next morning, the shareholders would revolt, and the company would be stripped for parts by the bank. I watched the realization sink into my father's eyes, that his own board was turning against him. He had spent 30 years demanding absolute loyalty, but he had forgotten that loyalty in business is usually tied to the bottom line. I stood up to leave, signaling to Sarah to gather our things. I told the room that I would be at my hotel, and that they had exactly 21 hours and 40 minutes left to decide if they wanted to save the jobs of 500 employees or watch the building be padlocked by creditors. As I walked toward the door, I didn't look back at Marcus's red face or my father's slumped shoulders. I felt a cold professional satisfaction. The daughter they had deemed useless was now the only thing standing between them and total obscurity. The night following the board meeting was the first time in 3 years that I felt the true weight of the power I had cultivated. I was sitting in my hotel suite, overlooking the city lights, when my phone began to buzz with a series of frantic calls from numbers I had blocked or deleted long ago. My mother was the first to try and reach me. She sent a long, rambling message claiming that she had always known I was special, and that she had only remained silent during my exile to keep the peace with my father. She tried to appeal to my sense of family, asking if we could meet for a private dinner to discuss a more amicable arrangement that wouldn't involve a public takeover. I read the words but felt nothing. Her loyalty was as hollow as the Italian sofa she had refused to move from when I was kicked out. A few hours later, a knock came at my hotel door. I wasn't surprised to find my father standing there, looking smaller and more defeated than I had ever seen him. He didn't have his usual entourage or his expensive briefcase. He looked like a man who had finally realized that his empire was made of sand. I let him into the room but remained standing, keeping the professional distance that had become my armor. He began to speak about the early days of the company, about the sacrifices he had made, and about how he had always intended for Harrison Industries to stay in the family. He admitted that he had been wrong about my ideas, but he begged me to reconsider the acquisition. He wanted me to come back as his partner, not as his owner. I listened to him for a long time, watching the way he struggled to find the words to apologize without actually saying the word sorry. I realized that even now, at the edge of total ruin, he was still trying to negotiate a way to maintain his status. I told him that the time for partnerships had passed 3 years ago when he told me I was nothing but a disappointment. I explained that the acquisition wasn't about revenge, but about the survival of the hundreds of families who depended on the company's payroll. If I let him continue to run it his way, everyone would lose their jobs. I told him that my offer was the only way to save his legacy, even if it meant his name would no longer be at the top of the letterhead. He sat on the edge of a chair, his head in his hands, and asked what would happen to Marcus. I told him the truth, which was that Marcus had no place in the future of Sterling Industries. He had proven himself to be a liability who prioritized ego over ethics, and I would not allow him to poison the new culture I was building. My father looked up at me with tears in his eyes, realizing that I was being as ruthless as he had once taught me to be. I told him that he had 24 hours to decide, and that 8 of those hours had already ticked away. I walked him to the door and watched him disappear into the hallway, knowing that the man who walked out was finally facing the consequences of the world he had created. The morning of the deadline arrived with a cold, gray light that matched the atmosphere in the Harrison Industries boardroom. When I walked back into that space at exactly 8:55 a.m., the air felt thin and the tension was almost physical. My father was already seated at the head of the table, his eyes bloodshot from a night without sleep. Marcus was nowhere to be seen, and a quick glance at Mr. Henderson confirmed that my brother had been barred from the building to prevent any further outbursts. The rest of the board members sat in a row, looking like a jury that had already reached a verdict. There was no more shouting and no more posturing. Reality had finally settled into the room, and it was a heavy, unyielding weight. I placed the final acquisition documents on the table, the legal papers that would officially dissolve Harrison Industries as an independent entity, and folded into the Sterling Empire. I pulled out my own pen and waited. My father looked at the documents for a long time, his hand hovering over the signature line. I watched as he looked at the logo of his company on the wall, then back at the daughter he had once told never to come crawling back. He finally spoke in a whisper, asking me if I was truly going to erase everything he had built. I told him that I wasn't erasing it. I was evolving it. I promised him that the Harrison name would remain on the building as a subsidiary, but the methods and the madness would end today. With a shaking hand, he finally pressed the pen to the paper and signed his name. One by one, the other board members followed suit. their signatures acting as the final nails in the coffin of the old regime. As the last person finished, I felt a wave of relief that was surprisingly quiet. There was no sudden explosion of joy, only the deep, steady satisfaction of a job completed. I took the documents and handed them to Sarah, who immediately began the digital filing process to notify the stock exchange. The transition was now legal and irreversible. The power had officially shifted, and the room seemed to brighten as if a dark cloud had finally moved past the sun. I stood up and addressed the board, but I kept my eyes on my father. I told them that as of this moment, every executive vice president was under review, and all current projects were suspended, pending an environmental and ethical audit. I told them that the new era of Sterling Harrison would begin at noon with a general assembly for all employees to reassure them that their livelihoods were secure. My father stood up slowly, looking lost in his own office. He asked what he was supposed to do now. I told him that he was retired, and that he should go home to my mother and enjoy the life he had earned. I told him that the company was in good hands now, the hands of the daughter who had finally proven that she knew exactly what the future required. The weeks following the acquisition were a whirlwind of restructuring and rebranding that transformed the very soul of the company. I moved into the top-floor corner office, but I didn't keep the mahogany desk or the pretentious awards that had defined my father's era. I replaced them with an open, glass-walled space that invited collaboration and transparency. The marble lobby was filled with digital displays showing our real-time energy savings and the positive impact of our new sustainable initiatives. The employees, who had been living in fear of losing their jobs, now walked the halls with a renewed sense of purpose. They weren't just working for a paycheck anymore. They were working for a company that finally had a vision for the future. My father and mother eventually moved to a smaller estate in the countryside, away from the prying eyes of the business world that they no longer commanded. Without the shield of his corporate title, my father had become a quiet man who spent his days tending to a garden, finally learning the patience he had never shown me. My mother continued to send messages, but the tone had shifted from desperate pleading to a cautious, distant respect. They were no longer my masters or my gatekeepers. They were simply people who had made a mistake and were now living with the quiet consequences. We occasionally spoke on holidays, but the conversations were brief and focused on the present, as the past was a territory we both knew better than to revisit. Marcus was the only one who couldn't accept the new reality. He tried to start several competing ventures with the remains of his severance package, but without the Harrison name to back him and without an original idea of his own, he failed repeatedly. The industry had moved on, and he was a relic of a style of leadership that no longer had a place in a modern economy. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he was bitter, still blaming me for the collapse of his inheritance, but his anger was like a ghost haunting an empty house. I didn't hold any malice toward him. I simply didn't think about him at all. I was too busy building the next phase of Sterling Industries to worry about the complaints of a man who had never learned how to build anything for himself. On the 3-year anniversary of the night I was kicked out, I stood on the balcony of my office looking out over the city skyline. I thought about the girl who had walked out of that mansion with a single suitcase and a heart full of terror. I realized that my father had been right about one thing that night. He had told me to go prove myself, and that is exactly what I did. But the real victory wasn't the millions of dollars or the massive headquarters or the look of shock on his face. When I walked into the boardroom, the real victory was the silence in my own mind. I no longer needed his approval or his validation to know my own value. I had built a legacy that was entirely mine, and for the first time in my life, I was finally home.